Hello and welcome to this special episode of Property Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to look at where to buy property to become wealthy. To do this, we'll link the total return formula to an area's average property price and desirability. Imagine you want to invest in a new city. How do you know which areas are likely to be a good investment and which areas are likely to be bad? There are many complementary methods to try and work this out. For instance, you can talk to an estate agent. You can visit areas to get a feel for them, or even do research on the internet. These are all great methods, but they take time. Wouldn't it be better if we could use data to identify the best investment area in minutes? This is what we'll do during this video to save you time and money when searching for an area to invest in. First of all, let's look at the terms that we used in this video. Property price refers to the average sale price in an area. Location desirability is whether people want to live in an area or not. Rental income is how much the tenant pays for rent. Costs are fees that are paid to maintain the investment property. Capital growth is the amount by which a property increases in value relative to the purchase price. And finally, the initial investment is the deposit paid to purchase the property, plus any other associated cost to complete the purchase. The potential for an investment property to generate wealth over the long term is calculated by the total return formula. This is essentially the return on investment when both rental income and capital growth are considered. The variables in this formula are heavily influenced by the property price and location desirability. The total return formula is normally used to evaluate the long-term return on investment of an individual property. However, in this video, we're going to use it to find which area in a city offers the best return on investment. First of all, let's look at the rental income. For a given property type or size, the more desirable an area is, the more rent that people will pay to live there. Therefore, rental income is influenced by location desirability. Next, we have the costs associated with renting out a property. Once again, these are generally similar for properties which are a given size or type. Location desirability and property price would have a small influence here. For example, a property which costs less might be less well maintained and therefore cost more to manage, and a property in a more desirable location may have less tenant arrears due to tenant income being higher on average. The third factor we have is capital growth. For a given property type or size, there is more competition to live in desirable areas, and therefore, over the long term, desirable locations are much more likely to raise in value than less desirable locations. Finally, we have the initial investment. Most buy-to-let products require a deposit of at least 25%, and therefore, the initial investment will be directly related to the property price. Looking at the formula as a whole again, the main takeaway is that the more desirable an area is, and the lower the initial investment, the more profitable an investment will be. This may seem obvious, but it's important to make this link so that we can use data to find where these areas are. While a property price is quantifiable, location desirability is not directly quantifiable. In order to try and quantify location desirability, a number of push, pull, and risk factors need to be considered. A push factor is something which makes people less likely to live in an area. For instance, it may be deprived. A pull factor is something which makes people more likely to live in an area. For instance, it may have good schools. And a risk factor is something that might happen but makes people not want to live in an area. For instance, a flooding risk. Since location desirability is subjective, it's not possible to measure it in a way in which everybody agrees with. However, the location desirability metrics here are meant to represent what an average person might consider when choosing an area to live in or invest in. The pull factor is schools. Push factors are universal credit and housing benefit levels, which represent deprivation. And finally, the risk factors are burglary levels and flood risk. For some areas, the burglary data is not present, and therefore the weighting has been modified to exclude it. In other areas, the flooding risk data is not available, and therefore the weighting has been modified to exclude it. Now that we've quantified location desirability, it's time to use this data, along with the average property price data, to find which areas have the potential to generate the most wealth over the long term. This graph shows sample data for average property prices against location desirability. The graph has been split into 4 quadrants to make it easier to explain what each area of a graph represents. Quadrant 2 represents areas which have the least potential to generate long-term wealth. They are expensive and have low location desirability. Quadrant 3 represents areas which have a medium potential to generate long-term wealth. They are cheap but have low location desirability. Quadrant 1 represents areas which have a good potential to generate long-term wealth. They are expensive but have high location desirability. Finally, Quadrant 4 represents areas which have the highest potential to generate long-term wealth. They are cheap and have high location desirability. When we look at the total return formula, it is straightforward to understand why Quadrant 4 is the best and Quadrant 2 is the worst for generating long-term wealth. However, it's not obvious why Quadrant 1 is better than Quadrant 3 for generating long-term wealth. The reason for this is that over the long term, the high capital growth of Quadrant 1 will have a much greater impact on the total return than the low initial investment of Quadrant 3. Let's recap on what we've learned today. The potential for an investment in property to generate wealth over the long term is given by the total return formula. The greater the location desirability and the lower the price of a property, the greater the potential it has in generating long-term wealth. Property price is quantifiable, but location desirability is not. Therefore, we must use various push, pull, and risk factors to try and quantify the location desirability of a property. If we plot property price against location desirability on a scatter graph, the areas towards the bottom right corner represent areas which have the average low property prices but a high location desirability. Therefore, it is these areas which have the greatest potential to generate wealth over the long term. Now that you know how to find the best location for generating long-term wealth, watch my other videos where I do deep dives into specific UK cities. Thank you for watching and see you again next time.